Our first speaker is Lisa Renk. She received an MLA with a concentration in writing and culture in December 2009. Described by one of her professors as interdisciplinary to her core, Lisa enjoyed the flexibility of the MLA program, which allowed her not only to study creative writing, but also to take classes in different academic disciplines each semester. Two of her favorite classes were the psychology and sociology of oppression and the politics of fiction. In February of 2008, she presented a paper titled Myth, Motivation, and the Origins of Violence at Penn's Graduate Humanities Forum on Origins. She's currently pursuing a career in adult literacy education. Lisa's capstone is a series of linked short stories titled False Statements and Other True Stories. Her primary reader was Catherine Watterson, and her secondary reader was Nancy Watterson. Lisa will talk briefly about what gave rise to her work, and then she will read an excerpt from her title story.
So when I first came here to check out the MLA program, I had just finished applying to law school, which is the academic equivalent of being pelted with frozen paintballs by a firing squad of modern-day Pharisees. Did you switch majors? Explain. Did you transfer schools? Explain. Did you have an interruption in your academic career? Explain. Did you have a poor semester? Explain. Explain! I had done all of those things and then some, and having to defend every decision of my life was starting to get tiresome. So it wasn't very surprising when I was waitlisted at the law school I wanted to go to. The MLA program was going to be my backup plan. I thought, at the very least, successfully completing a master's degree might finally put enough distance between the current grown-up version of myself and the sins of my youth. When a senior partner at the law firm where I work found out about the waitlist, he wrote a letter to the dean that went something like this. It was so nice having lunch with you the other day. As you know, our firm gives your law school lots of money. I'm ready to strongly recommend a candidate on your wait list. And then I received an offer of admission. I know that is simply the way of the world, but I had always held academia to a higher standard. So I turned it down and enrolled in the MLA program instead. In my second semester, I took a creative writing class with Kitsy Watterson. It was a memoir workshop. The very first in-class exercise required us to improvise, think on the spot, and be creative. My heart began to race. 9 years before, as a dance major in college, I had been required to take an introductory acting class. On the first day, the professor told us to come back ready to talk about the best day of your life, the worst day of your life, the most inspiring person in your life, and where you see yourself in 5 years. I spent the entire week worrying that I had nothing good to say for the worst day of your life part, because nothing bad had ever happened to me. And so it was ironic, the following Wednesday morning, as my classmates filed into Wolf Hall for the second week of Acting 101, I found myself trapped behind a reinforced steel door in a Baltimore City jail, living out the worst day of my life thus far. I never did get to tell my 4 things, and in fact dropped out of college 2 months later. Looking back from the memoir class, I realized something, and that was for all the bad choices I made and the years I spent regretting them, I now had tons of material. Put another way, I came to understand the salvation of art, and that became the theme of my capstone. Many scholars seem to share the conviction that art is the method by which we make sense of life. As Irish novelist Joyce Carey points out, actual life has no total meaning. It is simply a wild confusion of events from which we have to select what we think significant for ourselves. Aristotle said art gives us the universal in the particular, while Schopenhauer exalted art because when man contemplates it, he escapes from active desire and willing. Carey calls art the bridge between souls, made necessary because of the individual nature of humans. The form of art I worked on for my capstone is autobiographical fiction, structured as a linked short story collection. My collection of stories is linked by character. When the stories begin, Samantha Nash is an art student at a small college on the outskirts of Baltimore. She meets Jordan Byrne, a 30-year-old black man who grew up in the projects, shortly after he gets out of jail. Of course, they fall in love. These stories follow Sam as she gets sucked into Baltimore's rotting inner city and Jordan's manipulative grip. When she leaves him in an attempt to pull her life together with her 2-year-old daughter, Samantha must negotiate raising her biracial daughter in a white world while fighting to keep her hatred for Jordan from consuming her. These stories, this capstone project, are my attempt to make sense of the chaos of my life, my answer, if you will, to all those questions posed by the law school admission boards demanding that I explain myself in 5 short lines on an application form. So here it is. I'm going to read a selection from my title story. It's called False Statements and Other True Stories. And in the collection, this is the second story out of 9, and I'll be reading some abridged selections from the piece. On my way to the Baltimore City intake facility, I was telling the cops about the 50% police discount that we had going on at Henry and Jeff's restaurant during lunchtime. The 50% police discount, repeated the younger cop, the one who was driving. Just on your meal, though. Drinks are full price. I went to absent-mindedly brush away a strand of hair and almost smacked myself in the nose, forgetting my left hand was handcuffed to my right. Then I went on to inquire where they were taking my car, how I would get it back, and about what time they thought I might get out of jail. Tomorrow morning, you think? Because I have class at noon. Yeah, sure, said the older cop. He peered back at me through the bulletproof divider. That Jordan Byrne, that's your boyfriend? Yeah! Oh, my fiancé, I added. Nice guy getting you locked up like this. You want my opinion, you should get rid of him. You should dump him, the younger cop agreed. I rolled my eyes. You give dating advice to everybody you lock up? I'm doing you a favor, sweetheart. They parked the cruiser at the end of a long driveway and escorted me into a squat gray building. At what would be the front desk if it were a hotel, an intake worker glanced up, looked me up and down, and inquired, "What's she here for?" Which made me feel oddly glamorous in my status as not the usual clientele. The cops didn't answer her. I suppose it was a rhetorical question. When it was my turn to check in, I had to relinquish my diamond ring, the elastic ponytail holder around my wrist, and the bobby pins in my hair. And then it was into a small room with 2 female guards who told me to take off my clothes. All of them? I gasped. Good God, do I have to? Throughout 2 decades of ballet rehearsals, cheerleading practices, and gym classes, I had changed my clothes in many semi-public places. For example, the 5th aisle of the girls' locker room at St. Rose High School, the 3rd floor dressing room at Count Basie Theater, and a stock room at Monmouth Mall the time we traipsed around in our toe shoes and hoop skirts promoting that year's Nutcracker. But everybody else was always changing too, and although we were taking off bloomers and tutus and leotards, we were always putting other articles of clothing on. Even sex with Jordan was a quick change. He had 2 small children and no lock on his bedroom door. But I was in jail and I couldn't really say no. I took off my shoes and placed them neatly near the wall, aware on some level that I was trying to make a good impression on the guards, as if it somehow mattered whether or not I piled my clothing up neatly at the start of my strip search. Then I pulled off my sweater and socks. It was February, and the uncarpeted concrete floor was icy beneath my bare feet. I peeled off my long-sleeve shirt and added it to the growing pile of items that had formerly been covering my body. Then I unzipped my pants and stepped out of them. Finally, I unhooked my front clasp bra and peeled off my panties, remembering for a second the old adage about always wearing clean underwear because you just never know. Indeed. It's said that some people enjoy being naked, that they relish the opportunity to walk around the house in such a state when no one else is home. Well, I am not one of those people. I've never been anything short of mortified at the thought of my pale, scrawny figure, my ironing board torso, and my flat, shapeless, anticlimactic ass. But to stand completely naked in a room where everyone else is fully clothed, that is to feel the dynamic of power take away your breath. That is to envy Eve, because at least that bitch had a fig leaf. I looked up at the guards for confirmation that I had passed the test, but it wasn't over just yet. Walk over to that wall, said the second guard, pointing. I walked over to the wall. Once I reached it, I started to pivot like a runway model. No, turn back around and face the wall. Okay, now squat down and put your hands behind your head. If it was possible to die of embarrassment, I would have expired at that moment. Instead, I coughed when they commanded. Once I had dressed, they shuffled me into another room where Jordan and Howard were waiting online to have their mugshots taken. I sat on the bench, fiddling with my braids and getting used to the idea that I would be spending a night in jail. Except for the mandatory strip search and hepatitis vaccination, so far it wasn't unlike a trip to the DMV. Just a lot of sitting around, waiting for my name to be called by a bunch of unfriendly government employees. Yo, let me see your bag for a minute, said the man sitting next to me. I ignored him and stared at the wall behind Jordan. For no apparent reason I could see, brown bag dinners had been handed out to some of us, but not others. Then I noticed Jordan was moving, and despite the fact that we were in the middle of being incarcerated, he walked across the room, removed a Ziploc sandwich from my bag, and handed it to the guy. Thanks, man. Jordan had 10 years, 4 inches, 100 pounds, and an unquantifiable amount of life experience on me, including that he carried in his genes the DNA of slaves. We met when I started my summer job at the pizza shop in the mall where he was the assistant manager. He put me on the night shift, and the 2 of us had to close the store together. When we didn't have any customers, I stood at my register, refilling the napkin holders and studying the way his muscles tensed as he worked the industrial-sized can opener. Spread before us was a sea of teenagers feasting on cinnamon buns, smoothies, and vegetable lo mein. He asked me about school. I told him about my artwork. Art is a lie that makes us realize truth, he said. I thought he was profound. I like to think that he might have been an actor or a writer, but for the circumstances of his birth and the projects to a 17-year-old mother. I had dwelled too long in a land of whiny, suburban frat boy types. I wanted a man who had lived a little, and although I had no idea who he had been up until the day he walked into my life, this I knew: Jordan had lived. He possessed the ability to read me like a book, and I was infatuated with him. I'm now going to jump ahead in the story and skip over the rest of Sam's night in jail, and we're going to pick up the next morning when she's released. Half an hour later, I stepped into the sunlight of mid-morning on Eager Street and wondered which direction downtown was. I heaved over my shoulder the clear, oversized garbage bag containing all of my belongings. I have to get my car. Do you know where the impound lot is? For some reason, I directed this question to the crackhead I had been released with. This way, she replied. But after a few blocks, I began to have my doubts about her navigational skills. I decided to head back to Mama's house instead. Jordan's mom would know how to find the impound lot. When I arrived, I proudly announced, "We done got locked up." Mama resented my middle-class parents and college education, and I thought she would somehow approve of my fall from grace. Instead, she was pissed off. "We had no idea where y'all were," she exclaimed, and I realized Jordan hadn't used his one phone call to get in touch with her either. When Jordan arrived an hour later, the first thing he did was yell at me for not waiting for him outside the jail. "How did I know they were even going to let you out?" I protested. I went to see the public defender the next day. But my legal problems were minor compared to the trouble Jordan was in. His arrest was a violation of the terms of his probation, and for that, they could send him back to jail for 5 years. I was 21. 5 years might as well have been for all eternity. The night before the hearing, I clung to him, desperate to take in as much as I could before relinquishing him to a justice system I neither trusted nor understood. How could we put our lives on hold for half a decade? We had been looking at houses, planning a spring wedding. And Jordan's kids were toddlers. If he were sentenced, he would miss half their childhood. I couldn't imagine how he could be so stoic. In the morning, he kissed my cheek before lumbering out of bed and stretching his arms toward the ceiling. "Check up on Mama every now and then, will you?" he said. In the courtroom, I sat next to Jordan in the spectators section, gripping his arm. The tip staff came over to scold us. "Excuse me, the judge doesn't like people to sit so close together in his courtroom. That's totally inappropriate." "Inappropriate?" I whispered to Jordan as I slid away from him on the bench. "I might not see you again for 5 years, and this is fucking inappropriate?" He just shook his head. "They ignorant, that's all. Don't let it get you." In time, I would come to understand that inside that courtroom, we were considered nothing but welfare mothers, too busy getting knocked up to work for a living. Drug-dealing baby daddies in and out of jail, and dirty ghetto folk adept at ripping off the government and wasting the taxpayers' money. But at the time, my blood was boiling. They called Jordan up to the stand to plead guilty and be sentenced. He hadn't consulted a lawyer, hadn't lined up any witnesses to testify on his behalf, just strode up to the defendant's table and said nothing while the judge read into the record that on February 2nd, 1999, Jordan Byrne had been arrested for driving without a license, making a false statement to the police, and hindering an official police investigation, all of which were violations of the terms of his probation. How typical that it doesn't even matter whether or not you were guilty. The arrest in and of itself is a violation. I was beginning to understand something Jordan said occasionally when asked what he had gone to jail for. He said he was guilty of being black on a Tuesday. The judge gave him a suspended sentence. I didn't know what that was, but I remember thinking it must be good because Jordan walked back toward me with his paperwork and his freedom intact. And we were free to report to his probation officer, who thought I was a great influence in his life, and free to go back to Mama's and share the news with her and her husband, and Jordan's brothers, and Jordan's ex-girlfriend Shelley, and Shelley's sister Anne, all of whom were presently living with us in Mama's 3-bedroom townhouse on Lombard Street. And I was free to drop out of college and marry Jordan 2 months later, free to get pregnant with his child 8 months after that, and ultimately free to ride out of West Baltimore in the back seat of my father's Buick Roadmaster with my daughter, a couple of trash bags filled with our belongings, and $35 in cash. Thank you.